fuck. Hey, dude. Okay, so I'm gonna try my best to kind of like explain how to make a good grid, because like that's what perspective is all about, is if you have a good grid. So for 1 point perspective, it's really easy, so hopefully I can kind of explain it in an easy way. So I like the way that my instructor described it to me is that you're looking at points, right? So if you have 1 point perspective, you're looking at a compass. So you're either looking north, south, east, or west. Like it's, on a compass. 2 point perspective is where you've got north, east, or northwest in your peripheral. So you're looking northwest, but you still see north and west in your peripheral. So you're looking between two of the four directions. But for 1 point perspective, hopefully I can kind of describe it in a way that makes sense to you so that you can kind of figure out how things work. And the best thing about perspective is that at least there's a methodical approach to it mathematically. So if there's a system that you can figure out how to follow and what works for you, then you can use it to make good art. So like with 1 point perspective, try to view it as in like axes. So if you're working on an axis, like with 2D or 3D, with a 2D, you're working on an X and a Y axis. Like if you were going to graph a parabola in algebra, you're working on X and Y. But if you're working 3D, you have X, Y, and Z, right? So if you work on X, Y, and Z with 1 point perspective, then you're going to have only one axis that's tapering, and that's the Z axis, right? So you've got your X and your Y. So obviously the horizon line here is where the earth meets the sky, or what the fuck ever, right? The duality of man. So I'm gonna just draw a line here. I'm sorry it's in purple. But let's say, like what your teacher probably told you, like your horizon line is like pretty dead center down the middle. So I always divide it into fourths because that north, south, east, and west is useful for me. Although, like, for all intents and purposes, let's say we're looking north. And then you're going to just kind of divide things. And of course, I like to use the corners of my paper that I'm working with to make a grid. And it doesn't have to taper all the way to the end, especially if you're working in Photoshop or whatever. You just need to get that grid right. So if you can draw the lines to those corners, that works. Yeah, you can eyeball it for sure. It's not going to be perfect. But, that's what Photoshop is for. You don't have to be like a genius or any. Obviously, you can tell my X is off center. Okay, so like... then the next step is to kind of eyeball where the middle is, and you can definitely do that. You might need to take a few tries, but, let's say I'm just going to kind of do it sloppy for the sake of this. But you're going to have what kind of looks like a pizza, in a little bit. And of course, I'm sure that you've seen this all the time, and it's kind of frustrating because you're like, okay, so what do I do now? So what you're going to do is kind of draw a dotted line down what you think is the middle, right? So let's go here. And then let's say that you're using a picture of like what you used as a school hallway as a reference, right? So you're going to kind of eyeball down the middle of these first two columns here. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is definitely... I fucked up. It's definitely not perfect. Shit. But you get the idea, right? Of going, tapering to this vanishing point. And then, God, this camera's probably way off. Okay, there we go. Tapering to this vanishing point. And then, let's say if you have a picture you're working off of, let's say that you trace the tile, right? Or, this area where columns meet, or hotel doors, or whatever you're working with, right? Like temples, hotel doors. And so you're going to use this middle as a point. And you're going to use this kind of like X marks the spot to kind of gauge, because like for me, a big thing when I was first doing perspective, and especially in fine art studio courses, a big method is like, oh, well, just draw what you see. Look at your outlines, but then blur them or whatever. You never use black, never use white, whatever bullshit that people tell you. But you're going to use that to kind of gauge where you're at, right? So you meet down at this corner here, you make sure that you're, like, for example, if you got your ruler, you're like, okay, so I'm going to measure it. Where do I go? But you're going to use this grid that you've made where, you're drawing along the tile. So let's say you go through this center here, right? The center of the square. And then, or what is this basically the center of the square. And then you're going to go through this area here. And then you're going to use that to pinpoint where the next line in the grid's going to go. So let's say like, okay, about that I'd say is good. So even the bottom of this tile would be going off of the page, off of your line of vision here. So let's go like that, right? And then you can gauge that on the second side too, especially if you want to get a nice solid straight line. You kind of gauge the center of your square, and then you go up from there. So let's say, yeah, right about here. Right, these are really sloppy lines, and I apologize. But then like, okay, the next line of the horizon goes here. And you can use that combined with the knowledge, right, that, okay, so even if, like, for example, the hotel door on this hallway goes here, that the only axis that tapers is the z-axis. Every line that goes horizontally or vertically will not taper. So this line will always be straight, even though I can't draw a straight line for shit, and my shadows are everywhere, even though I cannot draw a straight line for shit. So this line will always be 100% vertical. This line will always be 100% horizontal. It's only if you're drawing a line like a wall or a column, right? And so if we were going to draw a column, we would kind of fit this ellipse in the center here. And like a good way to draw an ellipse too would be to fit the ellipse. And you can use Photoshop for this if it's hard for you at first, but fit an ellipse into this square. But a grid is really, really, really important no matter what you're working in, right? So, I don't know. If you have any other questions, maybe I can answer them for you, but hopefully this was enough of for me, this is really helpful in pointing me in the right direction to where I could fit things in a space. So, I mean, like, if you want to just keep going, with these X's, you just fit this corner here, you kind of gauge the center of your square, right? And then you go off from here, and then you can kind of X marks the spot, and you can build this grid off of that. And then you have like a really solid foundation. And in my experience, even though I'm a very instinctual artist, this grid is everything. And so like, I fucked that up, but whatever. So the idea is that, once you get good enough at making these grids, so like this is my 3-point perspective grid, right? You've got, and in this case, with 3-point perspective, you can look in whatever direction in 3-point perspective, obviously, but the X, Y, and the Z axis all taper to a point, right? And then with 2-point perspective, like let's say that this point is east, and then this point is north. So the center of this would be northeast. So you're drawing the vanishing points off of that and then working within this grid in order to make squares, circles, columns, cones, whatever. And then this is my, like if you were working with this grid right here, this would be my 1-point perspective, right? So I've been using those X's to gauge where the next line in my grid is going to be, and I actually have a measurable vanishing point versus just eyeballing it, which is what a lot of teachers tell you to do. So anyway, I love you very much. I hope this was helpful. I didn't mean for, God damn it, I didn't mean for it to be 10 minutes, but I guess I just, hopefully that was good enough. And Tanya says hi. I don't know. My mom left him with me. So anyway, he hopes you do your best.